After this creepy ghost ship was abandoned in the middle of a deadly snowstorm in the Arctic, it sailed the seas of the world completely unmanned for more than 38 years. Many people thought that the story about him was just a legend, until something unimaginable happened. The storm roared like an enraged beast, rushing out of the Arctic with relentless fury. The crew of the destroyer Baichimo clung to everything they could hold on to as ice formed on the deck, and an icy wind howled around them. Captain Sidney Cornwell, with a thick beard covered with frost, stood at the helm with a gloomy expression on his face. The ship was not designed for the crushing weight of the ice plates that surrounded them on all sides at the beginning of the Arctic season. The bay was supposed to be clear, but the weather turned sour faster than expected. Chimo Bay was trapped in the grip of ice as temperatures dropped below levels they had ever seen. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure, as if it too could feel winter approaching. Captain Cornwell was shouting orders, trying to get his crew moving, but everyone knew the truth. There was no escape. Not yet. "We have to leave him, Captain," one of the senior officers shouted over the sound of the wind. "We'll be crushed if we stay." Cornwell knew he was right. There was no point in dying with the ship. Nodding reluctantly, he gave the order. He wanted nothing more than to abandon his ship, but he had no choice. Either that, or they went down with her. The men gathered supplies as quickly as they could and loaded them onto a sled for a short hike to Barrow, Alaska, located half a mile away. The town was small, but they could hold out there for several days, maybe even weeks, until the ice melted, and Baichimo went back to the sea. At least, that's what they hoped. The team, huddled close together, made their way through the snow, exposing their faces to the biting wind. For some, this was nothing new. The Arctic has always been harsh. For others, it was their first experience of how deadly this region can be. But Cornwell's mind was on his ship. He commanded it for almost 10 years, transporting goods across the treacherous seas between Canada and Scotland. He knew every inch of this vessel, the worn wood beneath his boots, the way it cut through the water on a calm day. Leaving her was like abandoning an old friend. They reached Barrow as the sun began to set, flooding the frozen landscape with an eerie orange glow. The townspeople greeted them, offering what little warmth they had. That evening, Cornwell sat by the campfire, hoping that the ice would soon let him go. Ship. 3 days later, the team ventured back to the site of their trap. But when they arrived, they found nothing but broken ice stretching to the horizon. Baichimo disappeared. Ships don't just disappear into thin air, especially cargo ships with a displacement of 1,322 tons. Cornwell stared at the horizon, going over the possible options in his mind. Maybe the ship broke away from the shore and sailed away. Maybe it sank under the ice. But that wasn't the case. There were no footprints, no damage, no debris. Nothing. It was impossible to understand what had really happened. The team stood in stunned silence. The Arctic is an unpredictable place, but it was something completely different. Cornwell's stomach clenched in horror. In all his years of service, he had never heard of or encountered a ship disappearing without a trace. It was unprecedented. "She's out there somewhere," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. That's how it should be. It took several days before they received news from an unexpected source, an Eskimo seal hunter. He brought with him a hope that, in Cornwell's opinion, was impossible. He arrived at the small outpost of Barrow with a story that would have seemed incredible if it hadn't been filled with such confidence. "I saw your ship," he said in broken English, his face weathered by the weather. 45 miles to the west, still afloat. Cornwell didn't need to hear any more. Gathering a small group of people, they immediately went in search of Bessimo. If she was out there, they were going to find her, even if it was the last thing they would do in their lives. Soon, they spotted her, exactly as the hunter described, floating with the current and alone. trapped between pieces of ice, but still afloat. It was a real miracle. It's amazing how the ship got there unharmed and stayed afloat. Cornwell was relieved, but unfortunately, it was short-lived. Upon closer inspection, the damage to the ship turned out to be much more serious than expected. The ship's hull was cracked in several places, and part of the deck was covered with a thick layer of ice. The ship survived, but with difficulty. Cornwell realized that it was a miracle that it was still afloat, given the damage. He walked around the deck, assessing the situation. They were too far away from help, and winter was approaching fast, and there wasn't much time left. "We'll take everything we can and get out of here," Cornwell finally said, and there was humility in his voice. The vessel is not seaworthy. The team worked quickly, collecting what was left of the cargo and supplies. It seemed wrong to leave the Bay Chimo, but there was no other choice. When the last crate was unloaded, Cornwell took one last look at the ship, its silhouette clearly outlined against the icy expanses. It was a good ship, but now it was at the mercy of the sea. She would drown and live forever at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Or so he thought. Months have passed. Cornwell returned to Scotland with a heavy heart due to the loss of Betsimo. The Hudson Bay Company wrote off the ship as lost due to the harsh Arctic winter. Life went on, just like his career as a ship's captain, only now without his trusty ship. But the sea had other plans. It all started with whispers and rumors among the sailors who ventured into the icy waters of the Arctic. The ship was spotted far from where it was supposed to be. The ship looked damaged, old, and out of place. People claimed that there was no crew on the ship, and it was just drifting aimlessly at sea. At first, it was perceived as nothing more than sailors' tales, but the messages continued to arrive, from whalers, from fishermen, from passing ships all over the northern seas. It was Baichimo, presumably still alive and unharmed. In the early spring of 1932, almost a year after the ship was abandoned, a whaling crew spotted the Baichimo drifting about 250 miles from where Cornwell had last seen it. The crew tried to board, but a sudden storm forced them to retreat. New observations followed over the next few months. Each of them was more bizarre than the previous one. Of course, this was shocking news for Cornwell. He abandoned his ship knowing that it would sink rather than continue sailing. By the time the rumors reached Cornwall, Betsimo had already become something of a legend. They called it a ghost ship, floating aimlessly through icy waters, appearing and disappearing as it pleased. Cornwell didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was overwhelming. You can't just ignore the stories of sailors passed down by word of mouth, especially about haunted ships. The Hudson Bay Company has received enough messages to conduct an investigation. A rescue team was sent to the north, equipped with everything necessary to search for the missing vessel. But when they arrived at the place where the Betsimo was last seen, they found nothing but open water. The ship disappeared again. Did this mean that he had finally sunk, resting his mutilated remains? Or was there something more mysterious going on? By 1935, the legend of Betsimo had spread everywhere. Sailors from all over the world told stories of seeing a ghost ship, always alone, always drifting out of reach. Some claimed that the ship was cursed and that anyone who tried to board would suffer a terrible fate. Others believed that it was just a ghost, a figment of the cruel imagination of the sea. The mission: that those who claimed to have seen her were under the influence of alcohol or just homesick when they saw her. After all, it wasn't the first time. Although for some, the whole ghost story just didn't fit in their heads. Captain Hugh Paulson, an experienced Arctic explorer, did not believe in ghosts. He has spent his life navigating dangerous waters of the north, and he wasn't going to be intimidated by the old ship. So when he heard far. As for Betsimo, he set himself the task of finding her. After months of preparation, Paulson and his team set out in search of the elusive vessel. They followed the reports of the ship's appearance like breadcrumbs scattered across the Arctic. Every clue brought them closer, but Betsimo remained out of reach, always moving, always drifting, always elusive, as before. Finally, in the summer of 1935, Paulson's persistence bore fruit. They noticed a ship looming in the distance like a ghost from the past. The ice-covered vessel Bichimo, whose hull had suffered from years of exposure to the elements, looked as if it had frozen in time. Paulson ordered his team to prepare for landing, but as they approached, the weather suddenly turned bad. The winds howled, and the ice shook underfoot. They tried to move forward, but the Arctic had other plans. It seemed as if the sea had colluded with the ship, constantly preventing others from exploring its old, battered deck. Within a few hours, the ice closed in, forcing Paulson and his team to abandon their attempt. By the time the storm subsided, the Bichimo had disappeared again. It was extremely frustrating for everyone involved. Paulson returned home empty-handed, but the legend of Bichimo grew. Now it was more than just a ship. It was a ghost, a phantom that roamed the northern seas and rejected all attempts to capture it. And even he was now trying his best to deny this fact, despite his previous beliefs. How else could he explain the elusive behavior of the huge ship? The ship disappeared not only because it did not want to be boarded. Years passed, but Bichimo did not disappear into obscurity. On the contrary, it has become a legend in itself. A ship doomed to sail the seas of the world without a crew, never sinking, never resting. In the period from 1935 to 1969, he was repeatedly noticed by sailors from various walks of life. Each subsequent observation was more incredible than the previous one. Some said that the ship was in perfect condition, as if it had been preserved by Arctic frosts. Others described it as a rusty, decaying wreck, barely recognizable as the proud vessel it once was. But one thing remained unchanged. No one has ever been able to get close enough to it to board. Each attempt ended in failure, either because of sudden storms, shifting ice, or because of the inexplicable ability of the ship to disappear just when it seemed that it was within reach. It seemed that Bichimo had its own will, which decided to remain a mystery. By the end of the 1960s, Bichimo had become more of a myth than a reality. The sailors whispered about it, telling stories about a ghost ship that defied time and death. But despite all these stories, no one could say for sure what had become of him. Then, in 1969, 38 years later, she was last seen. On a cold winter day, a group of Inuit hunters spotted Bichimo drifting across the Chukchi Sea. They watched in silence as the ship moved slowly through the water, its tattered sails fluttering in the wind. There was no crew on board, nor any signs of life, just a silent, ghostly ship, alone in the ocean. Arctic wilderness. Word of the surveillance spread quickly, and the Alaska government launched an official search. For several weeks, they combed the surrounding area in search of at least some traces of Bichimo floating on the water or sunk under the waves. But despite their best efforts, they found nothing. Bichimo has disappeared again, this time forever. At least, that's what it seemed. For many years, people have been talking about the legend associated with the ship, and this naturally led to the legend continuing to live on. But no one expected to see her again. In 2007, more than 75 years after the Bichimo was abandoned, a new expedition was sent to find out the truth about the ghost ship. Armed with modern technology, the team combed the Chukchi Sea in search of any trace of the missing vessel. They used sonar, satellite imagery, and even drones to scan the icy waters, hoping to find the final resting place of the Bichimo. For several weeks, they found nothing. The sea seemed intent on keeping its secrets. Then, on the last day of the expedition, they picked up a signal. It was faint, barely discernible, but it was a metal object buried deep under the ice. A couple of years ago, it would have been impossible, but now they knew that it could be the discovery of their whole life. Maybe it's Bichimo. Had she finally found peace? The team launched a remote-controlled underwater vehicle, the camera of which transmitted video recording in real time to the ship. When the device descended, The outlines of the ship's hull became visible. The crew held their breath as the camera showed more details: rusty steel, broken windows, and the unmistakable Hudson Bay Company logo. They did it. 75 years later, they found the elusive Bait Chimo. There, in all her glory, she lay, eerily resting in the frozen prism that had formed around her. But as the camera slid across the deck, something strange caught their attention that shouldn't have been there. There was a figure standing on the bow of the ship, frozen in ice. Ship! It was a man dressed in a shabby captain's uniform. His body, preserved by the low temperatures, was visible to any observer. From what they could see, many assumed that this man was indeed the beloved ship's captain, Sidney Cornwell. For many, chasing the ship became his life's goal, which he eventually fulfilled. The captain, who had left the ship many years ago, returned, his body frozen in time, and he stood guard over the ship that he once called home. No one could say how he got there, but one thing was for sure. The Bait Chimo, a ghost ship that sailed the seas of the world for almost 4 decades, has finally found peace. What a chilling story, both literally and figuratively. Would you believe a story about such a ghost ship? How do you think the ship managed to stay afloat for so long? Who do you think the frozen figure on the deck of the ship was? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.